So I guess we can start. It's 4 p.m. So today we will talk about single object spectroscopy with the James Webb Space Telescope. So we will present both the fixed slit options, but also the time series, briefly the time series observations. So as usual, we will start to give you a recap of the different spectroscopic capabilities on board James Webb, and we will continue with a live demo of a real science-scape that will be done with the GTO team. So if you're comfortable enough with the ETC and the APT, we encourage you to try to follow us in the same time on your own laptop. But for the demo, we will need a template of a spectrum of a burn dwarf. So the spectrum can be downloaded actually from our website here directly, and we will use it for the ETC simulations. All right, let's get started. So with the recap of the different modes. So with James Webb, spectroscopy is possible from 0.6 all the way up to 29.8 micron using the 4 instrument. But for classical and stellar spectroscopy, there are two prime instruments, which are NIRSpec and MIRI. So NIRSpec has 4 slits and 1 big aperture to allow spectroscopy, so from 0.6 up to 5 micron, and then MIRI has a low resolution spectroscopy mode with a slit, but also a slitless configuration. So the slit, so the LRS will allow you to have a spectrum from 5 up to 12 micron. And beyond that, the only option to have a spectrum of your source will be to use the IFU, which is the medium resolution spectroscopy mode on MIRI. I will give a dedicated webinar for the IFUs next year. So there are also some slitless capabilities which have been basically designed and optimized for a time series observation using different instruments. So NIRISS spectroscopy is doable from 0.6 up to 2.98 microns. And then NIRCam, so NIRCam, the spectroscopy is only possible so far in the long wavelength channel, so with the GRISM, so from 2.4 up to 5 micron. And then MIRI, the LRS, as I said, has also a slitless option to have a spectrum up to 12 micron. So if we dive into the details, here is a summary plot of the different resolution as a function of wavelength. So as you can see, there are many configurations that are possible on James Webb. But what you have to understand in this plot is the following. So if you're interested in the complete wavelength coverage, at a low resolution, you will only need 2 configurations. So using the prism mode on NIRSpec and the LRS on MIRI. Instead, if you're interested in a medium resolution spectrum, you can use the slits on NIRSpec via 3 configurations, but also the slitless option using NIRISS, or the second and the first order, and also the NIRCam GRISM on the long wavelength channel. At the highest resolution, you can only use the NIRSpec and the MIRI IFUs using many more configurations. So this will cost you much more time if you want to access these type of resolutions. So how do the traces look like on the detector? So here is a sketch of the traces on each instrument, each detector. So NIRCam, as I said, is optimized for time series observation using the GRISM on the raw exterior horizontal direction, basically. So the GRISM will be spread out only on the A-type module along the horizontal direction. For NIRISS, slitless option as well. So the spectrum is actually much longer than the detector array, so the spectrum will be truncated, but actually it is possible to recover some of the wavelength coverage by using the 2 orders. So the second order will provide the spectrum from 0.6 to 1.4 micron, and then the first order will give you the spectrum from 0.9 up to 2.8 micron, if I'm correct. Just a brief reminder, so the NIRISS field of view is very large. The slitless So the spectroscopy mode is slitless. So basically, each source in your field of view will might contaminate your spectrum. So depending on your date of your observation and your position angle. So there is a tool called ExoCDK that can be downloaded from JWST. So using this tool, you will be able to evaluate the contamination of nearby sources at a given date and given position angle. But basically, the rule of thumb is to have spectrum separated by at least 3 cross dispersion widths, which is about 90 pixels on NIRISS, but 4 is recommended. On NIRSpec, so there are the slits. So that, as I said, there are 4 slits, actually 3, 1 big aperture, and a backup slit on the other side of the field of view, which should not be used for your science observation, at least in the first cycles. So there are no shutters on the slit, so they are always open. But there are usually, for the low resolution and the medium resolution configuration, the spectra are spread out on the left detectors and they fit within a single detector. But if you are interested in the highest resolution, and if you want a complete wavelength coverage, the spectrum would be very long, and actually it will be spread out over the 2 detectors. And because there is a physical gap in between, you'll have a gap in your spectrum. But there's a trick. Actually, there is a dedicated mode in NIRSpec that will basically duplicate your observation in the A1 and the A2 slits, which are similar, so that the spectrum will be shifted from one position to another, and you will be able to recover the gap. And then it will allow you to have the complete wavelength coverage. Finally, for MIRI, so as you can see in this sketch, there are 2 spectra. So one is dedicated to the slitless option, so on the top left. Again, there is no shutter in MIRI on the imager, so each source in your field of view will spread light on the detector. So if you have a very bright nearby source, that might contaminate your spectrum. So again, use the contamination tool to evaluate this possibility. There is also another location dedicated to the slitted option of DRS of MIRI, which is here on the bottom left side of the detector. All right, moving on to the obvious question about the brightness limits. So Jeff Valenti put this table together to give you an idea of the brightness limit that you can expect from the different instrument and configuration. So the table is actually not self-consistent because the modes cover different options, different wavelength coverage. So, but it will give you an idea. The final row for saturation will be given by the ETC. So this table has been computed for a spectrum which is not saturated for the entire range. So as you can see, actually you can go fairly bright if you allow your observation to have a single group, which is not recommended. But even though this is possible, and so for NIRCam using 4 amplifiers, you can observe fairly bright stars. But again, so especially for the prism, you can see that the limit is not very high. But if you're interested only in a sub-range of the wavelength coverage, it is possible to saturate one part of the spectrum and to obtain a high quality spectrum on the other part of the wavelength coverage. It's allowed and it's up to you. Moving on to the slits and slitless. So as you can see, there are many options. So basically, it is recommended to use a slits for a standard observation, which is not a time series, and especially for a faint target. So slits are available on NIRSpec and MIRI. They provide a wavelength coverage, as I said in the beginning, from 0.6 to 12 micron, using 2 or 5 settings. NIRCam and NIRISS do not have slits. So a slit has many advantages, but basically it reduces the contamination from the background. So you have an improved sensitivity on the line and on your continuum. So just to quantify this improvement on NIRSpec, the slits are 2 to 5 times more sensitive than the NIRCam Grism on the same wavelength range. And for MIRI, the slitted option on DRS is 10 times more sensitive than the slitless one. And again, the slitless spectrum might be contaminated by the neighbors, so that's why you might want to use the slit. But instead, there is some counterpart on the slit, so they are sensitive to flux loss due to telescope jitter and roll drift. So if you want time series observation for very accurate spectroscopic measurement, the way to go is to use the slitless option or the very large aperture on NIRSpec. Just like for imaging, usually on JWST, it is recommended to jitter your observation to improve your data quality, the background subtraction, and the sampling. So on NIRSpec, the jittering are split in two families. So there are primary nodes, so which are executed along the slits. So using 2, 3, and 5 options. So it will allow you to subtract the background. And there are also the secondary jitters. So basically, the jittering pattern will be executed for each node, and then moving on to the next node, repeating the jittering patterns. So jittering have been split in 3 options. So spectral to improve the line resolution, spatial to improve the point spread function, and there is also a mode to do both at each node points. As I said earlier, there is also special modes if you are interested in the highest resolution and the full wavelength coverage, which basically will duplicate your observation into 2 slits, the A1 and the A2. So it means that your observation will have a total time that will be doubled because you will repeat the noding and the jittering in each slit. So remember that. For MIRI, the jittering is only available for the slitted configuration on the RS. You can stare on your position, but there is also a 2-point noding option, which is done along the slits. And actually, the points are quite well separated and much larger than the PSF at the largest wavelength in this mode. There is also a user-free option for the jittering, which might be of your interest if you want to map your unextended source. So in this configuration, you'll be able to choose the number of jitters and the position on a pre-selected grids along the slits. For NIRISS and NIRCam, since they are slitless mode, jittering are not available. So time series. So time series observation have dedicated modes and templates with JWST. So NIRSpec, it's called the BOTS, so the Bright Object Time Series. So it will use the very large square aperture. And this aperture can be used with any gratings and any filters to allow you to have different resolution on your spectrum. On NIRISS, it's called the SOS, so the Single Object Slitless Spectroscopy, and will provide you a spectrum with a resolution of about 700. On MIRI, the TSO is done with the RS in the slitless configuration at a low resolution and below 12 micron. On NIRCam, time series can be done with the GRISM or with the imaging mode. So actually, if you're interested in the spectroscopic time series using the GRISM, so it will be done in a long wavelength channel, and it's possible to obtain simultaneous short wavelength imaging using a weak length to track your star during your observation. So this might be of great interest for this kind of observations. So the time series observation on JWST allows very long exposures, so longer than 10 kiloseconds. But you have to keep in mind that the high gain antenna might be able to move during such a long observation, and you might be able to notice this movement in your data. So of course, jittering and noding are not allowed for TSOs. And subarrays, dedicated subarrays and fast readout modes have been designed to allow a very high frame rate for a time series observations. Target acquisition. So for spectroscopy, target acquisition is a mandatory for the single object spectroscopic mode with all the instrument. And it is recommended to have a signal-to-noise ratio higher than 30. So there is a dedicated calculation template on the ETC that will help you to design your target acquisition. So I recall it is really important to properly define your target acquisition. Just to give you an idea, on HST, the second most frequent reason for failed observation is due to failed target acquisition. So do it properly. So in NIRSpec, there are two target acquisition options. The first one is the wide aperture TA, which is done via the very large slit. So it will allow you to acquire a very bright to moderately bright target, and is recommended if you don't have any position angle constraint for your observation. If you have a very faint target or a strong constraint on your PA, you may be better to use the MSA target acquisition. So it will use the microshutter array on a reference field to do the target acquisition. But this mode is not available for time series observation. On NIRISS, the target acquisition is done with the imager. So there are two configurations depending on your source brightness. So if it's too faint, it will not use the NRM mask to perform the target acquisition. On NIRCam and MIRI, it's much easier. There is a single option and a different filter combination or neutral densities that will allow you to perform the target acquisition. All right, we will, so I will just give you a recap of the James Webb jargon for readout. So an observation is made of several exposures. An exposure is made of several integrations or ramp. Each read along the ramp corresponds to a frame. It is possible during the process to skip some frames or to average several frames together in a group. So there are several readout patterns that have been designed for different modes. Basically, they all try to minimize the data volume during an observation. But all you have to do during your design is to select the proper readout mode and provide the number of group and integration. So for the spectroscopy on MIRI, there are two options, the fast, which is the default one, and the slow. So with these two modes, each frame is kept during the observation, but they differ in the way how the pixel is read out. On NIRISS, two options, the NIRSS Rapid and the NIRSS one for faint sources. So this one will average 4 frames in a group. NIRSpec, there are two modes which are very similar to the NIRISS one, so the NIRS and the NRS Rapid. And there is also an improved resolution, sensitivity and sampling, the IRS squared, which is designed for improved sensitivity on faint targets for very long exposure, but it's available only on the full array configuration. And for NIRCam, there is, yes, then question.
I have a question, Victor Halak. Can we change here NF and NS for NIRSpec? Because I look at that is postulated. I cannot change them.
No, you can't change the configuration of the readout patterns.
After, okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So as I said, for NIRCam, there is a full suite of modes depending on your source brightness and integration time. And here we refer to JWST. There is a very nice table that will give you the optimized mode for your interest. But for time series observation, the way to go is to use the rapid configuration. Subarrays, finally. So there are, for spectroscopy, several subarrays have been designed. So basically, they will all extract the entire columns on the detector, but they will only select a subset of rows. This is true for NIRCam using different sizes. This is also true for NIRISS. Full options are also available. And for mirroring, so if you do a slitted spectrum with the LRS, you can only read out the entire detector. But for the LRS slitless option, there is a dedicated subarray around the spectrum. So for NIRISS, it's very similar to NIRCam. As I said, there are two options for a subset of rows. And for NIRSpec, so there is a subarray for each slit. There is also a subarray for the all 4 slits together. So as I said, there is no shutter on the slit. So if there is a source on your slit, it will spread out the spectrum under the lecture. But this mode is actually mandatory if you're interested in the highest resolution and the complete wavelength coverage because of the duplication of your observations between the two slits. The full array is also available, as I said, if you're interested in the improved resolution, sensitivity, and sampling mode. All right, so I think that's it for the question, for the recap. Is there any questions so far?
Again, I'm sorry, it's Victor. You have told about time series boats. So
yes.
It should be just fast time series, so one spectrum can be taken after another right away. Can we use that some way how to schedule observation for 24 hours and next spectrum will be obtained another 24 hours later? So time series one after another, or just it can be with some time lag between the spectra?
Yes, you can schedule different visits for time series observation. You don't have to do a 24-hour long integration.
Yeah, you could. If you had like two full 24-hour observations, you could schedule them either back to back or with a specific time delay in between. Is that the question?
Yes, but should I use the mode boots, or I have to say that I have different observations?
No, so you would create two observations, and each observation would be with the bots.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question? I guess it's a no. So we'll start with the science case. So we'll mimic a real process to design a proposal, which, to remind you, are due for April 6th next year. So we will go through each step and use the different tools to design our observation. So we'll use a real science case, as I said, that will be done as part of a GTO. So here we'll obtain an infrared spectrum of a faint Y-type point dwarf using NIRSpec and MIRI. So the goal is to perform atmospheric characterization of this cool brown dwarf that cannot be done properly from the ground. So to do that, we will obtain a low and medium resolution spectrum from 0.6 to 12 micron using the slits. And we require a signal-to-noise ratio of at least 25 around 1 micron and about 100 around 5 micron. So actually, Loic will start with the EDC to design the observation. So if you're familiar enough, as I said, try to follow us in real time. And I will come back to you with the APT design. So I stop showing my screen.
Can I ask a question before we continue? Should we always use some spectra that have been observed from the Earth's surface? Or can we use as well for example, Phoenix theoretical fluxes calculated with Phoenix 15 or 16?
Yes, you can either put your own spectrum, or you can select to normalize from a library of model spectra, or you can choose just point source photometry, as long as you stay within those wave bands roughly. You can put a black body spectrum if you want. You can put a flat spectrum if you have no clue what the spectrum looks like underneath. So there are two components: a spectrum plus a normalization in a band usually.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is Loic. I'll share my screen first. Okay. All right. So as Julien mentioned, we're going to look at a Y dwarf, a brown dwarf, very cool at about 400 Kelvin. There are very few of those in the sky, and here is the state-of-the-art of our target that we have obtained with HST. So it's a low SNR spectrum in the near infrared, and that's basically all of the information that we got for this target, plus some IRAC photometry. So so James Webb basically opens the field for the study of those objects. So we'll start with the exposure time calculator. Let's start from scratch here. I'll log in on the ETC. I have a MyST account. You need one to really do a good job there, and so I'll create a new workbook and scroll down here and load the workbook. So the first thing we'll want to do is create a source, and it's a very simple point source. So we have one by default. We'll rename it with a proper name, WISE 1405. There's only going to be one source in our scene, so nothing fancy. Here we'll have to give a spectrum. So as I was saying, you could select various types of spectra, power law, black body, and models, and so on. In my case, I'm going to upload a spectrum that I already have. So the spectrum can be found on our webinar webpage at astroumontreal.ca webinar. I have this brown dwarf spectrum. I'm going to download it. A spectrum, the ETC accepts spectra that are 2 columns. Whoa, you see my passwords. You see 2 columns here. The first is wavelength in micron, and the second is FNU. So it's could be a Jansky, milli-Jansky. In my case here, it's not normalized to the absolute flux value, but you have 2 columns and roughly 1,000 rows. If you use spectra that have much more than that, calculations with the ETC will lag, will slow down. So you should keep your uploaded spectra to small files. All right, so well, I meant to upload the spectra, so we'll go in the section to upload the spectra. Selected. And it was successful. So I have a spectrum now that covers the whole SCD of my target. And you can, as you can see now, I have the option to select that spectrum. So I selected, and that's my spectrum. I need to renormalize its flux because it was not flux calibrated. So I will renormalize it here with Vega magnitude. I know it's a 14.06 target in Vega magnitudes through the filter Spitzer 4.5 micron IRAC. I could add emission lines. I will not. The shape of my target, well, it's a point, okay? But a new feature, you can now have extended targets and renormalize as a function of surface brightness. In square arc second or stereoid, very convenient if you have extended targets. But we have a brown dwarf that's a point source. There's no offset in the scene, it's centered. So I save this source, and that's my target for the whole ETC demo. You can see the SCD at the bottom. Previously, what we have from HST is those little peaks here in the near infrared, and you see the model spectrum has a large peak at 5 microns, and then a second peak in the mid infrared. So we want to explore the whole SCD. We'll take a better signal-to-noise ratio spectrum in the near infrared with the prism of NIRSpec, that's at low resolving power. A second setting will be to take a medium resolving power spectrum with NIRSpec around 4 microns to study this peak here. And the third configuration will be to use MIRI to cover between 5 and 14 microns or so to get this whole region here. Those are our 3 configurations that we'll do calculations for. So my scenes and source are complete. I will now do my first configuration, the NIRSpec fixed slit. It's going to be the prism low resolving power. If you have any question, please stop me when you have one.
I have one question. So we will use just low resolution and medium resolution research observations. So can we, just for an example, have also high resolution observations?
So you're interested in high resolution.
Yes.
I can do that. I can replace, but it's gonna. We have to reshuffle things with later on.
Okay, probably for the next time.
What I propose is after the hour, you just stick on the call, and I'll explain it to you for 5 or 10 minutes, if that's okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. So for now, we'll do the low resolving power prism. So we'll pick the prism. We'll pick the slit with it. We'll take the smallest slit. This one, by default, it covers the full wavelength. We always make sure we have the proper source and scene and properly normalized. We look at the background. Medium background level is conservative. That's good. So we had our instrument set up. The strategy, the analysis strategy, that's how you do the aperture or the spectrum extraction. You usually center it on the source. It's an aperture. By default, it's 1.5 pixel in radius, so 3 pixels aperture. For NIRSpec, that's fine. We're going to be using an observing strategy where we nod along the slit and use the other images to subtract the background of the other exposures. So that's the second case of background subtraction here, the noiseless sky background subtraction. Okay, so we're ready to do to set up our number of reads or groups and exposures and so on. The first thing I always do is explore what is the saturation point. What is the longest ramp I can do before saturating my target? So I'll use the NIRSpec Rapid, which keeps all of the reads without averaging any, and then change the number of groups per integration to see what's the maximum I can get there. So I explore. Let me try 350 reads or groups and see what happens. I calculate. So you see it takes a few seconds. If you had a spectrum, uploaded spectrum with 10,000 lines, it would take forever here. 1,000 takes already a few seconds. Oh, and I have a warning sign. If I look at the map, the saturation tells me that there is saturation for the amount of group. There's a warning here that I reach saturation. So 350 is too long. So 9 minutes here is the one ramp is too long, and I saturate. So I'll shorten this a little bit, 300, recalculate, and see if I'm okay. Yeah, the green check mark. So 300 groups, that amounts to about 8 minutes of time per ramp integration is fine. Then what I want to check is that the total exposure time at one spot is not much more than 15 minutes. So that's good. It's not the case. And then what I want really to do is, well, what's the actual total exposure time I need to reach my signal to noise ratio? I want, in this case, to look at this spectrum, and I'm interested in the near-infrared part. So let's say that I want, in this regime here, in this window around 1 micron, to reach at least 25 of signal-to-noise ratio. Say this at 0.95 microns. So I'll set the strategy so that my wavelength of interest is 0.95 microns. And the signal-to-noise calculated here will be based on that wavelength. I'll also change the number of groups and the number of exposure. The exposure here is basically how many different observing setups or DITR I use. And I use 3 for NIRSpec. So I have 3 exposure of 300, and let's see what that gives. So I want a signal to noise ratio of 25 at that wavelength I selected. And I have 49, so it's probably too long. I could shorten it, and if I put it to about 100, then I should get the proper expected SNR. Okay, I got 26. And if I look at the spectrum here, indeed, in this region, I get 25 or better. Great. So I've completed the first configuration. The second configuration is also with a fixed slit with NIRSpec, but it will cover the peak at around 4 microns. I will go with the medium resolving power for now. So I select here, make sure I have the good calculation, look at the scene, make sure everything is fine. The background is medium, okay. The strategy, I will center it on the source and use the default aperture with the noiseless sky background subtraction. The the instrument setup is where you change the GRISM. So I want this time the 395 GRISM with this blocking filter. So it gives me a nice spectrum between 3 and 5 microns. That's what I want. I'll use the slit, the smallest slit, this one by default. So I'm ready then to explore again, see what's the longest ramp that will give me saturation. For that, I always use all of the reads, so NRS rapid, no averaging. And I'll try with, I've explored this before obviously before the webinar, so I know that 1750 groups, which amounts to 45 minutes, will saturate. Okay, so I'll show it to you. 45 minutes is an awful long ramp to use, so I would not go above about 15 minutes. So indeed, it saturates here. I've got mild saturation. I could go 1700 and it would be fine. But rather than being limited by saturation here, I'm limited by basically the length of an exposure. So I'll shoot for 575 groups, which is about 15 minutes, okay? So that's about a third of my, until I reach saturation, a third of my full well of the detector. I'll also keep in mind that I'll be doing 3 exposures, 3 dithers, so I need to have 3 here, okay? So I'll see what that gives, what kind of signal to noise ratio that gives. Or if there's saturation there's no saturation for that. There's none, okay? There's no red, everything is green. So then I want to move on to what is the signal to noise ratio? What's my goal here? What kind of science I want to do? Okay, my goal is to have a, say, signal to noise ratio of 100 or better in the 4 to 5 micron regime. Okay, so I have between 200 and 100. I'm already good, so I'm already exposing too long, actually, or just enough. So what I'll do is, I have at 4 micron, I have about 200. So I need to drop this signal to noise by 2, which means the integration time by 4. So 575 divided by 4 is about 150. I'll put 150 here. And I indeed get a signal to noise ratio of about 100 in this region. I'm satisfied. I could have, in the strategy, put my wavelength of interest at 4 here, and I'll recalculate, and then you'll see it nicely that at 4 I get about 100. That's it. Okay, the third configuration is the MIRI LRS, low resolution spectroscopy with MIRI. I'm using the proper scene, background. I'll put medium to be conservative. The detector, so the instrument setup, there's no choice. There's only one grading. The strategy is always the same. You center the aperture on the source, use the default aperture, and use the other exposures for your subtraction of the background. Now I explore again, and I've seen that you know, 800 is roughly the maximum I can do. 37 minutes for one ramp before saturation. That's too long. 37 minutes. I would like to go no longer than 15. So I know that this is 325 roughly, gives me 15 minutes, and I'll see if I saturate. Well, just as a reference, I use the full subarray. There's no possibility to change this. And for LRS, the default is fast, and that's what we're going to use. So if I calculate that, it's green. There's no saturation. That's good. Now I want to reach in my whole region here. I want to reach about 150, say, of signal to noise. So I'm currently at about 25. So if I put at 5.95, I'd like to be 50. So I'll go in strategy, put my region of interest at 590, did I say 93, 95? Anyway. And yeah, so I need to basically, I have roughly 26, so I need 50. That means I need twice the SNR, so squared, so that's 4 times the exposure time. Okay, I can either change the number of groups, but I can't because I'm already at 15 minutes, so I can change number of integration. I should put 4 here. That will give me the signal to noise ratio I want, but actually remember that for MIRI, we'll use 2 noddings, 2 spots in the slit. So we have 2 times 2, that's 4 times. Hope you follow what I'm going fast, sorry, because of time constraints, but that will produce the SNR of 50. I hope you get the idea that I have 2 editors, so I need 2 here. And if I needed more SNR, I would just increase the integrations per exposure until I reach what I need. So I indeed get 50. Okay, the last thing I want to do is short, but it's important, is the target acquisition calculation. Before putting you need to put the target in the slit in order to take its spectrum. So to get, you need some imaging of the target, short exposure. So I'll start with NIRSpec. There's very limited things you can change in the target mode, the target acquisition mode. You could change maybe the background, but really what you want to change, you cannot change the, you can change, sorry, the acquisition mode. For NIRSpec, we're going to use the wide aperture target acquisition. It puts the star in a big square slit or square aperture, and you can take an image and center it. We'll use a clear filter to get as many photons as we can. In terms of strategy, we have no leverage here, nothing to change. In terms of detector setup, there's only 3 groups. We cannot change that. 1 integration, 1 exposure. The only thing we can change is the readout pattern. I'll stick to the default and see what that yields in terms of signal to noise. For target AC, you need a detection at a signal to noise of 30 in order to get a good centroid. So for this configuration, I get only 4. So how can I improve this? I can only change the readout pattern, perhaps. And you've seen that between rapid 0.06 seconds and NIRSpec 0.19, I get a longer exposure. So probably that will help. And indeed, I go above 30, which is what I wanted. You could go and have longer exposure times by changing the subarray size as well, but we don't need it. Good, and the final thing to do is the target acquisition for MIRI. So there's the target acquisition calculation available here. So same thing, very limited input. The acquisition mode for the LRS is, there's no option, it's this one. The filter can be changed. You can select whichever you want. My SED is peaking around 5, so I'm gonna use that one. There's no strategy to choose from. And the detector setup here is also as limited input. So you can only use, for slit, LRS slit, you can only use this subarray. And I'll use the fast default pattern, and let's see what that yields. So it's not enough signal. I'm integrating for about 8 seconds. So how can I change the integration? I could change here. I can change number of groups. So I'll change, say, to 9. And it's good. I go above 30. I'm not saturating. There's no red X. So that covers, I guess, the ATC. And we'll move on with Julien on the APT, unless there's a question.
It's Victor again. I'm sorry. Why do we need, could you please explain again, why do we need target acquisition?
Okay. Well, okay, let me show you this here. Okay, say that's an example for the MIRI instrument. Okay, the MIRI, that's a MIRI detector. The slit is the red rectangle here, and you need to have your star in there to get the spectrum. So, but before that, you know, the telescope points with some limited accuracy. So you take an image without any grading. You take an image of that blue region, and you try to center the star here, get an image here. And once it's centered at the sweet spot, then the spacecraft knows that it needs to move a definite amount to move the target in there. Otherwise, if you don't do target acquisition, your star may fall, you know, say 0.5 arc seconds or 0.2 arc second on the side of the slit, and you may not be taking a spectrum of any star at that point.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll pause share. We can't. Trying to. No. How do I stop sharing? Huh? Oh, yeah. Wait a minute. There.
All right, I'm back. So I will start sharing my screen again. So we will continue to design our proposal with the APT. So I will open the APT and I will create a new James Webb proposal. All right, I will select my target. So actually for the white dwarf, it's likely that it's not already entered into SIMBAD. So I will create a new fixed target. So here I will provide all the information that are needed. So the name in the proposal, so that will be WISE1405. I will give a proper name for the archive, and actually I will give the true name of that source, which is YPC1405 18.40 plus 55 34 21.4. Category, it is a star. Description is a brown dwarf. Let me see if I can. Brown dwarf, it's here. And if we want additional precision, we can say it's a white dwarf. Coordinates. So coordinates of my source is 1405, 18.4 in right ascension, and declination is plus 55, 34, 21.4.
I'm sorry, Julien.
Yes.
I have one question. If done in the description we cannot find the type of star that we are, for example, I'm studying, so does it matter what we put in the description or not?
So the description is mandatory. You won't be able to submit your proposal without any description, but you can be very vague. I mean, you can select, I don't know, it's the spectral
Can I say
type.
A star?
Yeah, A star is okay.
Okay.
Again, uncertainty in position. So for that kind of sources, it can be important. So it's about 0.1 and 0.2 arcsecond. It's not extended, which is recommended to, this information is recommended to provide for the data reduction pipeline. So it's a moving target. So it's really important to provide the proper motion of the source. And here it's minus 2263 milliarcsecond per year. And in declination is plus 288 milliarcsecond per year. It was done in 2000, and the parallax is 0.129. All right. So here you can give some comments, say, I don't know, the coordinates are not very precise because it has been detected from the ground or with wise, the precision is not really good. So all this kind of information that might be important to help scheduling the observations. All right, so my target has been, yes?
Wait, again, it's Victor. So uncertainty is related to the size of target on the sky. So 0.1, 0.2 arcseconds is just like the precision where the slit will be placed as.
No. It is the uncertainty on the actual measured position for that source. It is not the uncertainty on the slit positioning.
Thank you.
So I will now create my observation. So I will create a new folder, and into that folder, I have already an observation 1. So to help you keep track of what you do and to help the reviewer at the STSCI to review your proposal, make your title of your observations very explicit. So here we'll do the NIRSpec slit spectroscopy. So you will use NIRSpec fixed slit spectroscopy on our target WISE 1405. Target acquisition, so we'll use the wide aperture target acquisition. Target AC, you can keep the same target as observation, but just to be sure of what you do, always select your target, because if you make a change on your target, you will have a red cross here, so you will know there is something wrong, so always keep the actual target here in this field. Subarray, so we saw in the ATC with Throic, we need the sub 32 and the clear no filters. Acquisition time, we will use the NIRSpec mode, and that's it. So there is a warning here, and basically there is a new feature in the ETC, and if you go to the right, there is a box here that you can provide the ID of your workbook that you have used to design the target acquisition for this proposal. So it is not mandatory to fill in this box, but it's recommended to help the reviewers at STSCI to review your proposal. Science parameters, so we'll use the S200A1 slits using the dedicated subarray. Jittering, so actually, as we saw with Drake, we would do 3 nodes and no subpixel jitters. And the grating, so I will add the prism observations using the NIRSpec readout pattern. So we saw that we needed 100 of groups with a single integrations. And I will add now the medium resolution using the Grism 395 here. We saw that we needed 150 groups, but 1 integration. So basically, as you can see here, how the template is designed, the jittering and nudging pattern will be done for each gratings. So it is not possible to have a jitter for a given, for say the prisms, and no jitters for the prism, for instance. So basically the observation will be done first by moving the filters at each point, and then the telescope will jitters, and then will move to another node, and will repeat the observation of the different prisms and filters. So is the way it works so far.
Question
Yes.
here, if we want to have different, like with jitter, without jitters, we should prepare different observations.
So if you want, exactly, if you want different strategies, you will have to define different observations.
Thank you.
So one with the jittering, one without. But when you design different observations on the same target, you will go through each step, so you will get a new target acquisition. So the overheads of your observation will be much higher. So you'll have to play with the APT, and find out which is the best options, actually. Whether to have the same jittering pattern for each configuration, or to have different configurations. It's up to you. But usually the target acquisition is about 15-20 minutes, so it takes time. All right, there is a cross because I have not selected the subpixel pattern. So here, again, here you can provide the workbook ID here to help us review your proposal. I will now create a new observation for MIRI. I have observation number 2. This would be MIRI NIRSS slit spectroscopy. Spectroscopy using MIRI, the NIRSS. The target will be WISE 1405, target acquisition. So again, WISE 1405, acquisition filter, we saw we needed the F560 wide filter using the fast readout mode and 9 group. Parameters for observation, so it is a slitted observation, so the only subarray that is available is the full subarray. If you select the slitless prism subarray, it means that your LRS observation will be done without slit. Jittering, so we will use the 2 nodes along the slit, fast readout pattern with a 325 groups and 2 integrations. That's what we saw with Loic on our observation. All right, I have some warning again because I have not provided the ID of the workbooks, but it's not mandatory. So now I can run the visit planner to estimate the of my observation, basically to calculate the schedulability of my program. So it is doing here. I will go back to the form editor and to the proposal information. All right. So here I have, so I will provide a title, so spectroscopy of WISE 1405. I will get the abstract. It will be a geo proposal for cycle 1. We have here an estimated of the science hours, so basically the actual photon integration time and the total charge time, including overheads. So the proposal size will be automatically designed with the, depending on your charge time, so smaller would be programs below 25 hours. Science category, I have to select the proper keyword, so that would be a astrophysics, science keyword again, brown dwarf. You have to fill in all those information. And if I expand the proposal information here on the left, I can provide a kind of thorough description of the strategy that I have adopted for this program. So I'm interested in a low resolution spectrum with NIRSpec using the prism, and I will get a higher resolution spectrum of only 1 band, which is of high interest to me. That's why I will use only 1 prism and 1 feature. And then DRS using the slit spectroscopy. That kind of information that can be helpful to help scaling your observation. I will add also the PI, the COIs, and so on. All right, so it's a I think we have designed everything we need. Yes, that is it. So it's already 1 hour after the beginning of this webinar, so we will stop here unless there is any question. So if people want more precision or more explanations, we can stay here for 10 minutes. Otherwise, you are free to go on vacations, and we'll talk to you in next year. Thank you.
Hi. I'm prepared to have some advice how to do the high resolution observations.
Okay, we'll do that. I'm just before everybody goes, I'm curious about any interest for future webinars. If anyone has a strong interest in a particular mode or something like that, you can either speak now or send emails to JWST help at AstroU Montreal CA. Yeah, so if interested in anything that we can cover, it will be our pleasure to do so. Okay, so in that case, we'll stop there, and we'll actually go over the high resolving power case with you for those interested.
Yes, I am.
Okay, but feel free to drop those who are less interested. If not, I'll share my screen and we'll go with the high. Okay, so there I was. Okay. So the high resolving power with NIRSpec. Okay, remember NIRSpec. So we'll do a new fixed slit case. I'm going to actually show you some of the actual data that it produces, so you get a better idea of what it means in terms of images.
Scenes and sources.
Okay, so so you go first, always from the left, scene, make sure that you're properly normalized. I always select the medium background. And here in the instrument setup, that's where you select which one. So you can, for the demo earlier, we choose M for medium. We can use the H here. Do you have a preferred wavelength?
Yes, I would like say from 1 to 1 micrometer to like 7, 6. At least give me fast wavelengths that we can go with NIRSpec. Excuse me.
Yeah. Okay. So you're interested in the 1 micron to 7 micron.
Like, let's say, like I have interest from 1 to 15, but I believe that I have to split them.
Okay. So there is no single instrument that will cover this whole wavelength range, so you'll have to split it in two. You'll have to split it between the NIRSpec and the MIRI MRS, okay? The MRS is also an IFU. It's actually an IFU, and if you can also observe without an extended source in there, you can use a point source, but it's the MRS IFU, and that will cover the wavelength range between 5 and 7 or 15, 5 and 15.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I suggest for the MIRI MRS case, we postpone to January, because we're going to cover that. Mm-hmm. But for the NIRSpec, between 1 micron and 5 micron, that's also several setups. So you'll first need to, okay, let's scan through all of the different. Okay, ignore the red stuff for now. So this is the first grism that covers 1 to 1.8. That would be one first combination. Then you need to go to the second grism, 235 high, which goes from 1.7 to 3. Okay, and then do a third combination with 395 that goes from 3 to 5.
Okay.
So you see those are 3 sequential observations. You need 3. It's going to take a little time to do all those 3. Plus, you'll have to do the MRS with MIRI as well in different sequence. It's all doable. It's just you have to have a good science case to defend this amount of time that you'll use. So if we go with, say, this 3 to 5 micron example, you'll probably want to get the narrowest slit if you are interested in the resolving power. If you're interested in just getting the most flux possible, you may get a larger slit at the expense of not getting the full resolving power.
No, better high resolving power as
yeah.
as 200.
Yes, I suspected that. Okay, so then the strategy is the same as what we showed before. Basically, here you center on your target. You can, if you want, change the aperture. If you increase this number, you are going to slightly increase the amount of signal, but also increase the noise, the background noise. So this is pretty much the optimal that's set by default. Okay, and you're gonna want to dither along the slit, so in which case you use other exposure to subtract the background, so this is the noiseless case. If you wanted to not use other exposures, you can basically define regions on each side of the spectrum and use those as your baseline to subtract the background. This is the first case. Okay, and then you go with the detector setup, and that's where you set up this subarray here is for just taking a rectangle, or you could take the full image, but you don't necessarily gain here. If it's a very faint target and there's a lot of the readout noise is an issue, you can select this special readout mode, IRS2.
I actually just have a remark here. So if you're interested in the highest resolution and in the full wavelength coverage with NIRSpec, so as I said at the beginning of the webinar, you will need to duplicate your observation between the 2 slits, the S200A1 and the S200A2. This is because the spectrum will be so long that it will be spread out over the 2 detectors, and there is a gap in between. So you may want to duplicate your observation between the A1 and the A2 slits. So if you do that, you have to select the proper subarray, which is the all slit.
Okay, so it will be...
Is that clear?
Oh, okay, yes. Will we use dithering for that, or just specify 2 slits?
So dithering is always recommended. For background subtraction, at least nodding.
Yeah, I think it becomes a very fine detail, but I suspect that if you alternate between A1 and A2, that's it. You've got on one instance, you get just the background on the slit, and then you can use the other exposure. So I think it would just be fine to just nod between the 2 slits. Okay, let's just do a calculation, and I wanted to show you what the spectrum looks like, so that it will also demonstrate what Julien just said about the gap here. Okay, so here is the gap. Okay, you basically get you lose some small amount of wavelengths because it falls in the gap of the 2 detectors. So if this gap is of particular interest to you, because you absolutely need this wavelength, then you can use what Julien just suggested. That is, going from one slit to the other, it will move the spectrum basically left and right of the gap, and so you'll be able to recover this gap. Something else to look at is actually the images. If you download the actual image that's produced, you can see what the actual pixels look like. So there, I find it's always useful to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So this is the actual subarray of pixels, the two detectors stitched together. So if you zoom, I mean, if you zoom really, really large, you see here that here's the gap. On the left is the pixels from detector 1, and on the right is the pixels from detector 2. They are put together here as a single FITS file. And you see the number of pixels. It goes from, you know, if I go on the right here, you have 4,000 pixels, this number here. So it's all the pixels that you get. So in this case, I suspect it's not a science case that you'd want to do, but if you were to do this brown dwarf as a science case, and you'd probably want to go for a signal to noise of maybe say 50 everywhere. So then you need to adjust your detector setup. So we can use, regardless of what subarray pattern we use, we'll have to, you know, optimize this. So we'll use the NIRISS Rapid uses all of the frames, all of the reads, and we'll start by taking a large number and see what that gives. I still have a poor signal to noise ratio. I should need that. What is my strategy? I'm looking at wavelength 2.95. This is here. There's basically no flux coming out from in the ACD of this star. So I should rather look at this 4 wavelength micron, 4 micron wavelength region, recompute. I think you see how it works. Probably do you have any more information, a question on the ETC part of it, or do you have more questions about the APT part of it, or just the instrument?
Let me try. What's the question I had? How you can use this to increase the spectrum resolution? Because you said you can move little bit spectra, and you will you will double the time, but actually you'll get a higher resolution.
Oh yeah, okay, so you're talking about doing a small subditter along the spectral direction. Yeah, it's you can do it. I know with MIRI you can do it. And with NIRSpec you can do it. So it comes with a big Gaussian node though. So the idea is to move the source, you know, within the slit in the spectral direction to increase to hopefully double your resolving power. But when you move the star on the side of the slit, you actually also lose flux a little bit, and it may not be constant for all wavelengths. You may lose more flux in the red because the PSF is bigger than in the blue. So you realize then that you will need to do a good job of renormalizing your spectrum at every ditter position before being able to combine those different spectra into a single higher resolution one. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I see.
So
when I will do this, so I will get 2 spectra that I have to normalize separately, and after that combine them.
Yeah, at least that's how I would do it. I'm not sure what the pipeline does because the STSCI has a full pipeline for all the modes. I'm not sure if that specific observing strategy is processed properly with the pipeline, but in principle it should be like you just said. You have 2 spectra, you renormalize them, and then you produce a higher resolving power one.
Okay, thank you. Let me try different options that I have in mind, and after that I can send you email with some more questions probably.
Yeah, that will be great. Don't hesitate to send us any question.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Julien, do you anything to add more to this?
Nope. I think, yeah, so if you're interested in the complete wavelength coverage with NIRSpec, since there are 3 grism and filter combination, you will have to repeat your calculation for each configuration, and you will have to make one for each on the APT as well. So I think that's it.
Thank you very much for your help. Thank you.
Welcome.
Joyeux Noël.
Happy Christmas to you.
Thank you.
So our next webinar is January 10, I believe. Yes, 10, and we'll be talking about IFUs. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.